Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. This is the Banned Books Podcast, episode number 150?
45.
45, close enough. Excuse me.
Maybe.
And as always, 5-ish roundup.
Numbers.
That's Christopher Gillespie.
Dylan and Willen, Maxon and Relaxin.
And I am Donovan Riley.
The Techno Viking.
The Techno Viking, that's true.
Are you still the Techno Viking?
No, I'm the Warrior Priest.
Oh, you have a new moniker. Okay.
Although, Saturday, I was outside working out, and when my wife asked where Dad was, they said, my kids now say he's outside being Thor. Because...
like swinging a hammer or something?
I have this giant tractor tire, and I'm swinging and I use a sledgehammer, and it was storming out. It was thundering and lightning out while I was doing this. So I was thinking to myself that now would be a good time to test out that Marvel theory that if you're struck by lightning or bitten by a radioactive spider or caught in some sort of freak accident, you get superpowers because I'm out there swinging a metal hammer.
I mean, you might as well just like stick a fork in that socket and see if that works.
Right? So I had to laugh at that. Like, my transformation is almost complete, because anybody who's followed me over the years knows I have always said that if I wasn't a Christian, I'd worship Thor. Because as far as gods go, he's pretty cool.
Not video game lazy Thor, but...
No, like legit Norse Thor.
Right.
God of Thunder Thor, yeah.
Yeah.
With the two goats pulling his chariot, yeah.
Oh, that's awesome.
But, yeah. But we thought today we'd talk about anthropology and discuss... not only the ins and outs of the vocation, our vocation as pastors, but vocation in general, as we've been doing. Because I think what we were talking about before we hit record is, I think the big question right now on a lot of people's minds is what's going on?
Yeah.
Like, why is this happening? And why are we going from one thing to another?
How'd we end up in this situation? I thought we dealt with this already, right?
We went from Russia collusion to impeachment to COVID to the George Floyd killing. And at this point, people are just wondering, well, what's next?
Well, the asteroid's going to miss, right?
The asteroid's going to miss. Yellowstone might not explode. The wildfires at Chernobyl might not cause as much radiation to go back up into the atmosphere.
Oh, you mean those radiation clouds?
Oh, and also it's an above average hurricane season this year.
Yeah, we're going to have
it's going to be bad.
Tropical storm Cristobal is
Cristobal.
Yeah, it's going to.
Isn't that from Nacho Libre? Cristobal.
We're going to get some rain tomorrow from that. I'm like, wow,
Yeah.
in Wisconsin, it's only happened, I think this is the third time that something still classified as a tropical storm made it to Wisconsin.
Right. That's one of my favorite memes. Which chapter of Revelation are we on today?
We've had 3 out of the 4 horsemen, I think.
We really have. The cynical side of me is anticipating a terror attack, actually, whether it's domestic or foreign, but I'm just...
I mean, real war.
A terror attack like 9/11 or something compares to like the Japanese subway bombing, the sarin gas being released in the subways, or the Paris nightclub attacks.
Well, didn't I say it yesterday? I mean, this is like a perfect opportunity for a political opportunity.
Well, it's already happening. We know Antifa, like the FBI has already said straight up, the Justice Department has said straight up, we have people inside these different groups, these local Antifa groups. They're organized. They're more organized than ISIS and Al-Qaeda, they're saying.
Well, because they actually know how to use technology.
Correct.
Better than just like posting it on their Twitter profile.
I was listening to something last night, and in 2006, the FBI published their research that white supremacists have infiltrated law enforcement at every level.
Mm-hmm.
Significant infiltration, not a local yokel here and there, but every level, they've said, every level, and it's significant. In fact, an entire class in, I think, South Carolina, I might be wrong because I'm going from memory, but an entire class of cadets was actually released because they took a picture giving the Sieg Heil.
Good night.
The whole class.
Good night.
And it was kind of like, guys, read the room. Like, that's even if you're doing it as a joke, it's not funny in this context.
Well, that's the thing with Antifa in particular, is that they're sophisticated enough.
Right.
Maybe not at the what do you want to say, very local level. They have people with like a public Twitter profile. Like, that's not typical of the organization. But the exposés have shown that they have their own communication apps that are highly encrypted.
Mm-hmm. And yeah. Well, in Project Veritas last week, this is June 8th, 2020, for those listening in the future, but Project Veritas released video. They sent someone in undercover to get into the group.
A couple different ones, actually, right?
Yeah. I had to laugh actually watching the video about the guy coming from Sweden or wherever to train them about how to attack people. Because he's like, yeah, that boxing, that kickboxing stuff, that doesn't work. But the eyes are really vulnerable. You want to really poke them in the eyes.
Well,
and
if you want to inflict injury, right?
Good luck, by the way, inflicting that kind of injury on someone who's unwilling, first of all.
Yeah.
And second of all...
Well, that's the point. I mean, they're not attacking the strong. They're attacking the weak.
Right. And I've said this before. I've never been confronted in the street by somebody getting in my face. I remember when we went to Jordan Peterson at the State Theater here in Minneapolis, and there was protests outside the theater. And the protesters were going up and getting in the faces of people who were waiting in line to get into the theater. And I was standing there with my buddy, and I'm just like, God, I really hope that one of them comes up to me.
Right. Yeah.
And I'm just standing there, and I'm relaxed, but I'm staring at all the protesters, and I'm making eye contact, and none of them would come up to me.
No.
I'm the guy who sits at his door when the Jehovah's Witnesses are going around the neighborhood. Like, please come to my door, come to my door.
Bring it on.
And they see me in the doorway, and they just keep going.
Like the Bruce Lee thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there is that. And our friend Chad Bird sent me, we were talking about all of this yesterday because for those of you who don't know, I live 40 miles south of Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Yeah. And
the city council voted to disband the police department yesterday.
Did they vote, or at least the majority are willing to? Isn't that what it was?
It's a non-vetoable majority, and they voted to do it.
So it's a fait complete at this point.
Yeah.
Okay.
And even though the Minneapolis mayor has vowed to not completely disband the police department, he is the most impotent leader I've seen ever in this state. And I mean that sincerely. He is the most impotent man that I've ever listened to as far as a leader goes.
Yeah, well, I saw that when he tried to speak at the protest.
The social shaming.
And then they ran him off because he said reform the police instead of defund.
Right.
And they're like, no, we're not. We see through that.
Do you know the history of social shaming and communism?
We talked about this, didn't we?
I discussed this yesterday in Bible study for those of you who want to go back and watch that video from yesterday morning. But social shaming is very popular, like in communist China, in that when a political official shames the party and essentially breaks from the ranks of the party, one of the ways they're dealt with is you have to walk the gauntlet, so to speak. You have to go out in public, walk down the street, and be publicly shamed for shaming the party.
You mean like the Queen in Game of Thrones?
Yes, exactly like that. Yes. Yeah. And that's what Mayor Fry did yesterday. He did social shaming because he's a communist. He's a leftist. He's not apologetic about it at all.
Well, he was shamed, though, publicly. That was the thing. It got turned on him.
Well, that's what I'm saying, though, is he did that on purpose.
Oh, he wanted sympathy?
He wanted to be shamed. That's what he does.
He wanted to be shamed into action.
Yes.
So he doesn't have to accept responsibility for it.
Correct. He does that all the time. He gets on the microphone and he does that almost crying thing.
Yeah, right.
That pastors sometimes do.
Yeah.
Where they get emotional, but it's kind of contrived.
I'm the victim here. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm serving the will of the people. I want reform. This is, actually, to quote the other side, go read The Art of the Deal by Donald Trump. And this is something he talks about in that book.
We're not endorsing Donald Trump, by the way. Haters.
Right, yeah.
But we are endorsing the book. Okay.
Well, I'm just saying it's worth reading because if you want to understand Donald Trump as a negotiator, go read his book. He literally published the blueprint for how he does this. Mm-hmm. But in the book, he's like, when you negotiate, you never come in and lowball a negotiation. You never give the actual number that you want.
Why would you?
You always go high and negotiate down. This is classic negotiating techniques. It's in numerous books.
Well, that would be absolute, and that's unthinkable. Why would you ever do that?
But he lays out all of these strategies for how to control the conversation, how to control the negotiation so that you get what you want and they don't ever really realize what you're doing to them. You're manipulating them. And a big part of that is to give them the sense that they're controlling the flow of the conversation.
Well, that was Dale Carnegie too, right?
That's what I'm saying. Yeah, that's what I was trying to think. Not Irving Berlin, Dale Carnegie. He writes about this in his book.
What was that one?
Business and Leadership.
The art of influencing people or something like that?
Yes. Yeah, making friends and influencing people.
Yeah. How to win friends and influence people.
So when you look at it from the other direction, it's a passive aggressive. Well, I didn't want to. So what you say is, I want reform. You take what in this situation will be considered the conservative stance. We should reform, not disband. So then when they publicly on camera demand you disband the police department, you can then look at the city council and say, well, I didn't want to do this, they wanted to do that, but they're serving the will of the people, as we all saw.
Right.
And I am a public servant. This is what happened with my governor. 3 weeks ago, his attitude towards constitutional rights was stay home or we will fine you and arrest you for opening up your business. Then when people start lighting the city on fire, all of a sudden he's all about civil rights and all about my constitutional rights.
Well, and this is really, you're hovering around the topic that I was hoping to get to.
Right, exactly.
Which, well, I know that's intentional, but to think about like, okay, you're to serve the people, but what about virtue? What about your own, recognizing your own failings and flaws?
Right.
What about also
character?
Yeah.
Integrity.
Well, and doing what is right, even when it isn't,
correct,
popular.
Right.
Which is hard.
I talked with somebody about that again yesterday, that what is populism? I talked about this on the Warrior Priest podcast when I was reading the propaganda stuff by Goebbels. Populist is essentially, at least the way that Goebbels lays it out in relation to German propaganda. And by the way, he wrote the playbook for propaganda for every government and military leader since World War II. Mm-hmm. They all follow that playbook. But essentially what populism is a leader or someone, they take the temperature of the emotions of the population,
okay,
and then utilize technology to manipulate the masses by getting them emotional and taking the temperature of their emotions. So for example, after the Treaty at Versailles, things were pretty down in Germany.
Yeah.
People weren't real proud of their heritage. And there was a depression, and people were literally carrying wheelbarrows of money to buy bread. German patriotism was almost non-existent. People were ashamed to be German. There was no pride in your home or your job or your name because of the depression and existential depression.
Right.
So when Hitler comes along and says, those people in parliament are the problem, they're perpetuating a system that is basically, keeping you under the thumb of the aristocracy. So number one, we got to overthrow this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to rebuild the economy. I'm going to give you pride in yourself, pride in your home, pride in your community, pride in your nation again. And this is how I'm going to do it. I'm going to start Volkswagen and Fanta, and I'm going to bring back X, Y, and Z. All we got to do is get rid of these people.
Yeah.
And once he got the will of the people behind him by playing on that emotion, he then said, we're going to withdraw from the League of Nations because we are an independent Germany. We don't need other people to give us permission to do what's best for our people. But because he had gotten that leadership currency through those reforms, the people then said, yes, when Hitler speaks, he does speak for the people of Germany. We're behind him. So therefore, the final solution that's not his primary platform when he runs. He doesn't come out of the gates like, let's kill the Jews, homosexuals, gypsies, and black people. Like, he doesn't start there.
Right.
He starts with, I'm going to give you pride in your nation again, pride in your job, pride in yourself. We're going to rebuild the economy, and I'm going to give you something to be grateful for. And he does it. He proves it. They give him that leadership currency. They give him that trust. So then...
because of the small wins that he had.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
So by the time we get to the final solution, the will of the people is Hitler's will. Now, to break that down into a very smaller, more practical instance, to discuss anthropology, when you become a pastor of a congregation, the growing pains in that transition, a lot of times is the personality of the pastor does not align with the personality of the congregation. And every congregation does have a singular personality with certain quirks depending on people and groups. Over time, the pastor and the congregation find a kind of middle ground where the two personalities overlap or meld, right?
And then you have a collective will.
And then you're not, hey, that's Pastor Riley or Pastor Gillespie, but rather that's our pastor. That's the pastor of our church.
If that happens.
If it doesn't happen, the pastor usually leaves. Or there's a split within the congregation.
Exactly.
And you have this office called the office of the ministry. And it comes with obligations and responsibilities that precede you and proceed you. Your personality may actually be in conflict with the office. Or your piety or your doctrine may be in conflict with the office as it exists within that local congregation. For example,
we're not talking about right or wrong here. We're just talking about what is.
Yeah, okay. I'm talking practically. So when I got here, weekly communion was anathema because this congregation had been indoctrinated for 5 or 6 generations that weekly communion is wrong.
Right.
Just morally, it's wrong. Because then it's not special. And if it's not special, people will stop coming to church. And if people stop coming to church, we won't have a church.
And that has its roots in what we've talked about many times, that pietistic tradition.
So, but this started way back in the 30s and 40s.
Right.
It didn't just happen, the pastor before me. It was generation of indoctrination, so that then when I come along and I open up our Lutheran confessions and I simply read from the Augsburg and Apology to the Augsburg Confession about celebrating the Lord's Supper.
Every Lord's Day.
They look, every Lord's Day, every holy day. And then I read the constitution of this congregation. On the front page, we subscribe unconditionally to the Lutheran confessions. I asked my members at that time, well, do you or don't you subscribe unconditionally to this? Because this is what it says.
Right.
And the answer is no.
But that indoctrination, at least I think this happens often. We call it tradition, but it's really just excuses we made. Because of some other context or some other reason. I mean, like, for example, we want to celebrate the Lord's Supper every Lord's Day, but like at the beginning of our congregation, mine anyway, we didn't have a pastor every Sunday.
Right.
So we're like, well, that wouldn't be right. We can't celebrate without a pastor. But then after a while, you're like, well, that's just what we do. And then later on, you're like, well, this is why we do what we do. You're like, no, that's actually not why. The history doesn't line up, but you've forgotten your history, and so you've lost your why.
Right. And to the point then, and I think this brings us back around to the political side of this as well, which is there can be no change without violence. Mm-hmm. And what happens then practically within the ministry and within the context of that congregational personality and indoctrination and tradition and the excuses, which are really lies, you either make that transition, like in my congregation, we celebrate the sacrament weekly and every holy day. My people have been catechized now into that, so therefore their attitude towards the sacrament is a complete 180 of what it was 12 years ago when I got here. But the 4.5 years that I took catechizing them into that, there were people who left
because they didn't want the violence.
They were essentially they were offended that I would quote unquote push my opinion, my agenda on this congregation versus a majority of the congregation who said, well, it's written right here. It's very simple to understand. And it is in our Constitution, so maybe we should take this more seriously.
Right.
Or rewrite the Constitution.
And arguably, I mean, you can back up even further, maybe not so much with every Sunday communion, but with a lot of other things. I think you can do it with every Sunday too. Is like, really, if the pastor's doing his job, he's asserting the Lord's will.
Correct.
Not his own personal will.
Right.
But that is so high level because it requires one, that you submit to the authority of Jesus, and thereby submit to the authority of the Scriptures, right?
Right.
And to do so requires, again, it's violent. His interaction with, especially with unbelief, but it comes off very violent.
Well, can you name just off the top of your head, name an example of where God shows up in Scripture and there's not violence? Even when you are comforted, like Psalm 23, right? Like I eat in the midst of my enemies. I eat
in the shadow of death.
There's a lot of conflict there in the shadow of death. Mm-hmm. We read Psalm 8 yesterday for Bible study and for morning prayer. And the name of God, according to David, the name of God is what has true power and glory. So he says, when I look at the heavens, when I look at the earth, I look at the work of your fingers.
Right.
It's your name that bears, mentioning, because your glory is your name. The power of God is in his name. So if we are not gathered together in the name of Jesus, if we are not baptizing in the name of Jesus, receiving the sacrament in the words of Jesus, instituted by Jesus, if we're not singing and praying and living in the name of Jesus, I think we really need to take a step back and ask, why are we doing any of this? Why are we here?
Well, and I think maybe I use that word lordship, or no, I didn't. I meant to. But you have that word Lord, the name of the Lord, right? And Lord can be violent, but it can also be benevolent, right? It can be a good thing to be under a Lord, right? If the Lord is giving and good, right? It can also be violent where the Lord is oppressive and a tyrant.
Right. When Paul uses the term Lord, which would be translated as Caesar, that's an act of political treason. He knows very well what he's saying, that there's no Lord but Jesus. Mm-hmm. He's saying there's no Caesar but Jesus. And at that time in first century Greco-Roman society, you didn't say stuff like that. That's why the Jews say to Pilate, "You're no friend of Caesar."
It's a call to action, really, a violent revolt.
Right. It's like we were talking about, when you say you're no friend of Caesar, the modern equivalent is, if you don't post against racism on your social media feed, then your silence condones racism. You must be for racism if you're not posting against racism.
Yeah, I quoted that meme to you, and it was a black background, of course, and then it was, what you don't condone, you condemn.
Right. And what I noted was, it's a weird twist on the saying, what you tolerate in your presence becomes your standard. Mm-hmm. Because that's true. If you are with someone who is ragging on a close personal friend, your spouse, one of your kids, and you say nothing, you are establishing a standard for that person, that they can say these things to your face, because they know now, well, he's not going to defend his wife or his kids. He's not going to stick up for his friends. You've basically said, here's my standard. Yeah. Go ahead and do this.
Except every day you're making that value judgment. You're asking that question to say, am I going to engage? Am I going to ignore? Or am I going to walk away? I mean, what's going to be and it's a risk question, right? What's the risk?
Which goes to your point about integrity. Mm-hmm. Because that's what integrity is. Integrity is knowing the difference between right and wrong and doing what's right, even if everyone says, stop doing that, you're wrong.
Yeah, but you can't speak against... right now with Black Lives Matter, you can't speak against the slogan or have any kind of critique of it.
Right, because emotions have taken over the whole conversation. It's emotionalism writ large.
Did you see the conflict over J.K. Rowling? She posted a tweet about basically you can't get rid of the sexes, or there's nothing to talk about, right? I mean, if there's no sex, then then you can't be a feminist, because it doesn't even matter anymore.
It's kind of the point of feminism. Well, at least when I was young, I would think I was in the overlap between second and third wave feminism.
I was gonna say there's waves, and we're in fourth now, I guess. But
yeah, or fifth even. But when I was in the early 80s, for example, when I was little in elementary school, the criticism against women at that time, against feminism, was the shoulder pads and the pleated pants, that you tried to look like a man.
Right.
But every generation wrestles with this, to the point, though, to not dismiss it either. Because I was listening to, I think he's a minister in the South. But anyways, he made a good point. At least I think it's a good point, is that saying, when someone says Black Lives Matter and you say, well, all lives matter, he drew this analogy, and at least it was helpful for me. Maybe it'll be helpful for you listening. When my house is on fire, and I run up to you and say, my house is on fire, I need you to help me put it out. And you say, well, wait a minute, all houses matter. We need to worry about all the houses.
Dismissive, okay. Yeah.
One, you're right. All these houses matter to these people. But my house is on fire right now.
Right. Yeah, let's be attentive to this.
So right now, I would say this is the topic, Black Lives Matter, because of what has happened with George Floyd and many, many other people.
Yeah, it's not a one-off event.
No, and to this point then, and this goes back to the point of change being violence and the question of anthropology and why humanism gets it wrong all the time. Because this minister asked this point, when have Black lives mattered? When they were slaves, under Jim Crow, when Black Wall Street was being burned down, when they were being ghettoized in the early 20th century, when the civil rights movement and segregation, and during the civil rights movement, they weren't allowed to sit, at the counter in a cafe. They weren't allowed to use the same bathrooms. In the 80s, during the crack epidemic, in the early 90s, when Joe Biden ran through that bill that incarcerated more Black people than at any other time in American history. Like, when did Black Lives Matter to this point? When? And I tend to agree with his logic.
Yeah.
In the sense of when he runs down an outline of Black history in America, you're like, oh no, you make a salient point. To me, he made a salient point. Like, when did Black lives actually matter? Mm-hmm. Up to the present tense.
Well, on the one hand, I mean, we can't destroy race, because if we destroy race, I mean, this is how people identify themselves, right? I mean,
that's how God made us.
Well, it's true. And he never actually flattens it out. I was doing a little reading on maybe what we call like racial diversity in the Bible.
Right.
And it's something that I don't know. When I was catechized, when I was taught the Old Testament in particular, it was just kind of just everything was about Israel, right? And then you look inside Israel, and you find out that like Abraham, he's from he's from Chaldea. It's part of Mesopotamia, Aramean or something. They said right. His children marry Canaanites.
Right.
Joseph married an Egyptian woman.
Right.
I mean, you just keep going. The people who came out of Egypt, it's called a mixed multitude. It's not even, not even all, there's Egyptians with the Israelites leaving, right? So all that stuff about the sojourner, that's what it's about. Moses married a lady from Cush.
Right.
So she was black, right? Which is Egypt. Rahab was from Canaan.
Right.
Ruth was from Moab.
But this gets to the heart of this conversation, which is that God is an artist. He creates. That's what defines him as a creator. He's a creator. That's how we define him.
He doesn't make everybody the same?
He makes, and so as someone who went to art school, as someone who trained in music, you don't, like, when I look at a painting where someone used 13 different shades of white and calls it art, I just like, that's just lazy. That's not even creative.
Oh, man.
That's just boring, right?
Yeah, right.
God uses every palette that he himself created, every color that God creates. He uses the whole palette when he creates us.
Melanin, right? Melanin's the coloring. Yeah.
So we take everything that God has made and we use that to actually draw out our differences and then use that to justify our discrimination, our bigotry, our hatred for the other person. Because I've lived in Mexico. Mexicans are super prejudiced against other Mexicans, depending on what bloodline you come from.
That's why. Has there been a Hispanic response to Black Lives Matter?
Some, but no one's paying attention.
It's amazing how quiet that is. Like, Like, why are we?
No, there has been, but it's just not covered by the news.
What about us, right? I mean, do we matter?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
It's not just white, black.
And I have friends from Africa who talk about Africans being prejudiced against other Africans. In India, I have friends in India. The color differentiation between Northern Indians and Southern Indians and Northern Africans and
they can see it. We can't see it.
Right. I have friends in South Africa who are Boers. They're Dutch by descent, but they're African because they were born in Africa. They live in Africa. But then when they're told you're not African because you're not black, they're like, wait. Like, how do you define African then? Like, Africa equals black? So I've seen this in other countries.
And then you have like genocide within like Rwanda, right? Where to the outsider, to I mean, we can't.
Right.
There's what is it? Or what's the other one? Sunni and Shia. And it's not even really all that ethnic. Actually, it's just religious, but they can tell instantly.
But it goes back before. It's tribal. It's like where I was at in Guatemala. These two villages hated each other because one village used to sell out the other village to the conquistas.
Right.
Because the conquistas would come and be like, we're going to take all your people captive. You're our slaves. Hey, those folks down the road are so much stronger than we are.
We'll help you out.
Let us help you.
Yeah, we'll help you.
Right? And this happened in Africa too with tribes. The point is then to bring it back around, we do this with cities. Cities are an abomination of creation. Because what a city is our attempt to recreate what God did.
Wait, if we put a park in the middle, then it's okay, right?
Right. If we just pave this, so skyscrapers are mountains and canals and sewage tunnels, and those are all the rivers and the rivulets and so forth. And we put zoos and aquariums in these cities.
Artificial recreations of the original.
Yeah, we artificially recreate creation.
Some creatures don't care and actually thrive in that, like the rats.
Right, they've adapted.
There's something like 4 or 5 times as many rats in New York City as there are people.
I think it's like 10 to 12.
Is it that much? But the average length is 18 inches.
Right. Well, did you hear what happened during the COVID shutdown in New York City with the rat population?
Yeah, they got desperate.
And they started going a little bit too far.
Pretty
People
aggressive.
Like, whoa.
Because the restaurants
super
were closed.
Aggressive. Yeah, exactly. They didn't have the trash wasn't there. So, yeah, you see what kind of animals thrive in cities. Not the pretty ones.
That should tell you something, right?
You're right. But you look at, there was a video from Thailand of the monkeys, because all these, I think they were baboons or whatever. And no, they weren't baboons. I'm sorry, that's Africa. But anyways, all these monkeys, they actually get fed by tourists. And there's no tourism, so therefore they're just roaming the streets in packs of hundreds. Well, you saw the monkey on the motorcycle kidnap the baby.
No, that's crazy though.
So a monkey it was not like a little street circus kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And so this monkey is on a motorcycle, spots this baby, this like 2-year-old baby, rides his motorcycle down the street, grabs the baby and drags the baby away. And then all of a sudden this grandpa or whatever starts to chase after the monkey and yells at it.
Out of necessity, it gains sentience, huh?
Yeah, but you're like, that's the world we live in right now. A monkey on a motorcycle tried to kidnap a baby.
Wow.
In broad daylight in a city. So that's what happens, though, is that what humanism did is it eliminated the God of the Bible because we didn't want to be judged for our actions anymore. We didn't want to be accused of sin. We didn't want to have to worry about hell. So we just got rid of God.
And we didn't want to embrace the wonderful diversity that God has made us in either.
That too. Well, and notice that when humanism became popular, it coincided, not coincidentally, with the destruction or the tearing down of the sacraments and the incarnation of the body, the body of the church, the incarnation of the church on earth.
And it was utopian as well.
Yeah, just like now.
Yeah.
This utopian vision that, we'll disband police forces and we'll police ourselves and everything will be great because we can increase the number of social workers and we can have prayer circles and just re-educate people.
Arguably, though, you'd still need the Second Amendment.
Oh, I have lots of friends who were diehard liberals up until this.
Yeah.
And they all got guns.
Yeah, out of necessity.
Yeah, there's a lot of people I know who live in the suburbs who bought guns now.
Well, what I think is interesting is that, I mentioned utopianism and then the church, and like you said, the denial of the sacraments and the incarnation of the body. But you think, but heaven, there's going to be no difference in heaven. And it's like, that's not the picture the Bible gives either.
No.
Because God will gather every tribe, language, people, and nation, right? There's those four things. Tribe, language, people, and nation, those aren't gone. It's just that they understand each other, that they're brought together, but not in a sense that they're all whitewashed, right?
Right.
Or however you want to view it there.
German Jesus on the wall.
Yeah, or Western European. We'll just be a little bit more broad.
Yeah.
No, the distinctions will still be there, and yet they'll be embraced and they'll be rejoiced in, and look at how
we'll see the beauty in it, the artistry.
Fearfully and wonderfully made, the psalmist says, right?
The sad part of humanism, though, by getting rid of God, or at least making God sit in the defendant's chair and justify his every action. Also, this coincides with Jesus being a good moral teacher, and the advocacy that when we die, we don't actually die; we actually float free of our bodies and ascend to some spiritual other world where we're all just blissfully, like we're on Xanax for eternity. But this all corresponds then with, now all the responsibility is on us.
To be God?
But to be God in the sense of, it's up to us to change the world and fix things for the better. That's why we are where we are today.
Because we keep trying to fix things?
We keep trying to fix things. And I just read this morning about in Hawaii, they had a rat problem. So they introduced mongooses. The problem is they didn't know that rats are nocturnal and mongooses are and aren't. They're diurnal.
Okay.
Which means sometimes they're active at night, sometimes they're active during the day. So now they have a rat problem and a mongoose problem.
And mongooses, these are not, what do you want to say, passive creatures?
No, they're not.
They're pretty aggressive.
No. Yeah. So Australia is a classic case of this. They've done this a dozen times. Every time we try and fix something, because actually, I can't remember if it was Technopoly by Neil Postman that I was reading yesterday, or this article by Freeman that we will get to eventually, either this episode or next episode. That whenever we try and fix things, we always want to take credit for the idea or the plan, but we never want to take responsibility for the consequences.
This is, by the way, Rick and Morty, season 4, episode 10. That's correct. That's the context. He makes a clone of his daughter, but then how do I take responsibility for what I've done? And yeah, modernity refuses to take responsibility for the consequences of our actions. That's kind of one of the tent pegs. So what ends up happening then? This is why victim culture is so popular, because it appeals to our lesser demons. In the sense that it lacks integrity, it lacks courage, morally, emotionally, and intellectually. And it lacks failure. I mean, you can't fail if you're the victim.
Right, you can't fail. You're always failing up because you can always point at the mayor or the governor or somebody else.
Oppression.
The pastor. It's them. It's always them. You think of the French Revolution, for example, or you think of Marxism, but the French Revolution is kind of at the front of my brain. The problem is structural. The problem is these men who built this system of oppression, this aristocracy, this monarchy.
Revolution, then overthrow.
So if we get rid of the monarchy and institute a bureaucracy, things will be better. Well, Napoleon did that. And after about a year, people decided that bureaucracy sucks. Because before you had to go to one guy, bribe him, and you got your permit to build your house.
Right.
Now you've got to go to 33 different desks, because that's what a bureau is. Literally people sitting behind desks. Well, where's your pink slip? What do you mean? I have a yellow and a blue slip. Well, you need a pink slip.
Yeah, TPS
well, where do I get the pink slip?
Too, right?
You need TPS reports, exactly. And then they said, you know what? Bureaucracy sucks. Let's overthrow the bureaucracy and reinstitute a monarchy. And they did.
Or a different, that's that historic case. In other cases, it's just, we just need a different bureaucracy. We didn't,
right.
Or like I was saying, like there's a political opportunism happening, but also I think there's a missed opportunity perhaps. You just say, well, maybe now it's time for a third party. I know we keep having that conversation and it doesn't happen.
Ain't going to happen.
Well, it's
Not
because the parties that are in place haven't quite corrupted themselves to the point of overthrow.
Right. They've perfected corruption and cronyism.
Well, what do you call that? I mean, it's equilibrium or
homeostasis.
Homeostasis. Yeah. That's the right word.
Yeah, you're either Team Democrat or Team Republican, and since they own the media's mouth, the media will say whatever the Democrats or Republicans want them to say because they're all run by the same people.
But not all media. I mean,
corporate media.
Conservatives have talk radio.
Well, podcasting, I think, is a wrinkle to that because you're more free from that system to say what you want to say, but there's still consequences once it gets. It's like the cop from Seattle who made that video about telling other cops, hey, we're here to enforce the law. We swore an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States. These executive orders are not constitutional.
Right.
Cops are overstepping their authority and they're behaving brutally towards the citizenry. We're not supposed to.
What's the policy where they're qualified exception or something like that, where they can't be criminalized. Their actions aren't
right. Well, they can't be sued. Yeah,
because it's something that the police unions,
they're trying to get that overthrown right now
at the federal level. I think.
Yeah, and I think it's the Senate. Mm-hmm. A bill was proposed. And I think just this morning I saw that the Democrats are pushing it through. They've come up with a whole bill around it, of course, because that's what politicians do is add fat to it, add pork.
But there was something similar with when we had those doctors that would post videos on YouTube speaking against COVID-19 and its treatment in particular, or
turns out they were right.
The severity of the disease or whatever. Yeah, but at the time... Yep. They were lambasted. Some of them lost their job. Yep. How dare you...
Same thing with hydrochloroquine now.
Yeah. How dare you speak against... Hydroxychloroquine. Yeah. How dare you speak against what science has shown today? Well...
Right.
But who's going to hold anybody to account for any of that? We were saying that in the midst of it, and even now.
Well, because when were the emotions highest? When those doctors and researchers were coming out and saying, well, no, and they were shouted down because when we're emotional, we're easily manipulated. That's why... Havoc Journal website I followed, somebody wrote an article called "We Are the Useful Idiots," because essentially we march in the direction that we are told to march in when we become angry or are feeling guilty. When we're overcome by our emotions, we march to the drumbeat of whichever politician or whichever leader calls the tune, because we're not able to think anymore. We're just reacting.
But if we're in the midst of the moment, then we're easily victimized, right? Or we can at least use that as an excuse, right?
Right. Because all we see is the tree. Yeah. Again, it goes back to, I was a victim. I didn't know.
Right. And so there is no accountability then.
One of my devotions this morning was, when you're a child, you are not responsible for your indoctrination. But as an adult, you are 100% responsibility for the indoctrination that you went through as a child. Meaning, at a certain point, as an adult, you need to wake up and start to question what you were taught as a child, good, bad, or indifferently. But you become self-reflective and self-aware.
That's what being an adult is, isn't it?
Well, it used to be.
Even if something as simple as parenting, to say, not everything my parents did was right. I can still honor them, but actually the best honor I can have of them is, as I reflect on it now, to say, that's something that maybe they regretted and that I could do better. If I recognize it, rather than just repeating the same failure over and over. Which,
within the vocation of parenting, I think is a virtuous pursuit. Now,
you're going to make this your own set of mistakes,
but in Freeman's article about population, societies, groups of people, as soon as you say, we're going to right the wrongs of the last generation. Because we're going to fix history. Well, there's only one Lord of history, and that's Jesus Christ.
Well, you could just take that whole Tiananmen Square thing and just act as if it never happened.
Well, I see a lot of people comparing what's happening now to Tiananmen Square and saying that essentially the government are just like communist China, and that this is our Tiananmen Square moment. I love that. I love when people say stuff like that. Like, who is a politician who said this is our Spartacus moment? And he'd obviously never read about Spartacus or saw the movie.
Oh.
It's like, no, that's not how this works.
No.
Likewise, this is not our Tiananmen Square moment. There's no tanks in the streets yet.
No, that's terrible.
It's
and good luck finding, I mean, if you search the internet, good luck finding stuff on it.
right.
It's amazing how well they, not only just within China, but even outside of China, how well they've suppressed images, video, even descriptions or commentary on the event.
I'll read this section from Freeman's article. Modernity has as its goal the creation of a better world with no particular reference to God. It is a secular concept. As such, that which constitutes quote-unquote better is or can be a shifting definition. In Soviet Russia, it was one thing. In Nazi Germany, another. In consumer capitalist societies, yet another still. Indeed, that which is better is often the subject of the political sphere. But there is no inherent content to the better, nor any inherent limits on the measures taken to achieve it. The pursuit of the better, usually referred to as progress, becomes its own morality. The approach of classical Christianity does not oppose change. There is always change. Nor does it deny that one thing might be better than another. But the quote-unquote good which gives every action its meaning is God himself, as made known in Christ. In classical terms, this is expressed as keeping the commandments. Those commandments are summarized in the love of God and the love of neighbor. There are other elements within the commandments of Christ that minimize and restrict the use of violence. There is, for example, no commandment to make the world a better place.
What?
Yeah, I know, right? Nor even to make progress toward a better world. The quote-unquote better world concept is historically a heretical borrowing from Christianity, a secularization of the notion of the kingdom of God, translated into terms of progressive technology and laws. And in parentheses, by laws, he means violence.
Yeah, violent law.
Because there is no law that can be enforced without the threat of violence behind it. But in truth, the management of history's outcomes is idolatrous. Only God controls the outcome of history. There it is.
That's beautiful. This is Father Stephen, right? Stephen.
Yeah, Father Stephen Freeman.
Right, Orthodox priest, OCA. But boy, he's got his finger on it, doesn't he?
I think so. And this is the article title again is The Violence of Modernity. And like we were just talking about, the violence within the context of the shelter at home order, the executive orders made by different governors and so forth. The violence behind that was, if you leave your home, we will arrest you and fine you, or we will fine you $1,000 and or arrest you.
And they didn't even have the law behind them, but it didn't matter.
It didn't matter because, like I said, that cop from Seattle got fired for posting that video. Another cop got fired for posting a similar video.
Well, and if a church had been, there were some of these churches that were kind of sources of outbreaks because they chose to gather anyway. Maybe for good cause. There was a funeral or something like that. And then they were publicly shamed. Right. Because how dare they go against the better judgment of society, of scientists, of governors, and gather around God's word.
Well, and here's the key point for me in what Freeman said is that progress is its own morality, which is why you see people comment on, well, the left eats its own. Whereas I can actually say within my own church body, we eat our own all the time.
Yeah, and we're relatively conservative.
Because when you don't have an enemy, a common enemy, you create one inside. Because it's a spiral of violence. It's an ever tightening spiral of violence. So in the end, Mayor Fry in Minneapolis, who rode into office on a leftist political agenda, was devoured this past weekend by the people that voted him into office, because he now is the common enemy. He represents the problem to them, because that morality shifts with the emotional dynamic of the group. Yeah. So when the group is happy and contented, the morality of the leader is, hey, we like this guy. He's a good guy. He's good. When the emotions shift to rage and anger, now this guy's morally evil. Now, has he shifted? No, actually, he's a populist. Right. He just parrots whatever the popular sentiment is based on the emotions of his constituents. But now they're going to eat him.
Well, and you can see this in other, kind of tribal groups. I'm thinking of it was gay, lesbian, then transgender, bisexual, Q, I guess, general queer, and then plus now, whatever. You've seen as many as, 14 or more, letters.
The alphabet people, as Dave Chappelle calls them.
Alphabet people. And part of the language there was, to go to at first it was acceptance, right? We want to be accepted, but then they wanted to be praised, as a group or as a culture. But now it's fractured because it became so large to almost be nothing, right? The tribe is fractured because the standard was that we had something to fight. We were fighting for our rights. Now that they have maybe what originally they were looking for, whether it was, to be recognized as marriage or whatever,
right?
Or just, simple things like being able to do be the next of kin, deathbed or something like that. We got what they wanted. Now what? Now what are we fighting for? Well, then they end up turning on themselves and, different parts of those people. Like, I don't want to be associated with the alphabet soup. I want to be, my own separate person.
Well, do you know why a lot of police forces were originally established in this country?
No, I don't. What's the history there?
To enforce slavery. They were actually put together they were slave patrols. They were to catch runaway slaves and make sure that the slaves stayed on the plantations.
So it wasn't for protection of property and individuals and households?
Well, slaves were property.
Well, there's that. Okay, so they were reclaiming property.
Right. And this has been brought up numerous times. And again, I was a gap in my historical knowledge.
Wow.
And
we just assume they've always been there, right? Kind of like fire departments.
Well, I always thought it came out of like when you watch Gangs of New York by Martin Scorsese. Like police, I thought historically, the police forces were created to basically stop gangs from running different precincts or communities or neighborhoods in these major cities. Like that was their role. And then to go back and find out, well, here's a gap in your knowledge, Donovan. A lot of police forces were created to enforce slavery, go out and catch runaway slaves and make sure they didn't leave the plantations.
Yeah.
So if you're a black person in America and that's part of your history, then in the present tense, you're looking back and going, well, what's changed?
Yeah.
What has really changed? Again, when has Black lives ever mattered? And what is the history of the police? And then after the Patriot Act in 9/11, the militarization of police forces in this country, in the sense of they were given military grade weaponry and armor and vehicles. It's like a friend of mine said, I'm not against police per se, and I believe that they're necessary. On the other hand, I do think it would be beneficial if we demilitarize them and
thought a little bit more about why they exist in the first place.
Right. And really, to my point too, when I listen to mayors and governors talk about, well, the police force is corrupt or racist, the system is racist. You're at the top of that system, Jack.
Yeah.
You are the Wizard of Oz. You're the man behind the mayor's the one who gives permission to the police chief to say to the police on the ground, you can use rubber bullets and tear gas.
What's the motto? To serve and protect? Something like that?
Right. It's essentially the same thing the same oath that soldiers take when they enter the military.
Right. Yeah, but they're under the direction of their, governing officers, right?
Right. In my state, at least, only the governor can call up the National Guard. That's his military, essentially.
Right.
So if you see the National Guard on the streets and you're mad at the mayor of Minneapolis, you're mad at the wrong person. The governor is the one who calls up the National Guard. And that's been my primary complaint throughout this is we are focused on the tree so narrowly that we don't see the forest. Like and I'm just going to go off on this. And again, I am neither a Democrat nor a Republican. I do not have a team. And I grew up in the 70s with a Vietnam vet. I don't trust government. You don't
trust the man, right?
I don't trust authorities. I don't trust institutions, period. I don't trust church institutions, let alone political institutions.
I mean, I'll reveal my voting record. I either don't vote or I voted third party for the most part.
Well, and I think that's something that we should probably talk about too, even maybe in this episode is, do Christians have a responsibility to vote or not? And is it a matter of Christian freedom, whether we vote or not? Because I don't vote either. I don't. Because I actually agree with George Carlin. If you vote, you're part of the problem. If you vote and then the guy you voted for gets in and you complain.
Now you have to accept responsibility for your apathy.
Right. That's the other side of it. Absolutely. That's the other side of the argument is you didn't vote, so you don't get to complain either.
Yeah, it's true.
Because you're not a part of the process. I get both sides.
But you're not progressive on this. You don't think your vote actually is going to make it that much of a difference?
No, absolutely not. Because I have been around long enough and studied enough and talked with enough people within politics and law enforcement and the military to know the system's rigged. Go read Madison's papers, by the way. Go read Madison.
This is what we were talking about. That trying to get my head around, like, okay, you and I have pretty low anthropology. We don't expect that this world is going to be a better place. I mean, this myth of progress,
right?
You know, it isn't to say that God doesn't destroy and then build up again, right? That we don't see kind of a more cyclical thing happening.
We just pray that it doesn't happen in our lifetime, so we don't have to live through it.
The point, though, is that that doesn't mean you're devoid of personal responsibility, right? That you do have a responsibility, but I think what Father Freeman here has in mind is that it's not global, it's not national, but it is, as he said, expressed in keeping the commandments, love God and love for neighbor. So and we're not talking about the neighbor around the world. We're talking about, you know, your family, your congregation, your immediate community. Care for the people you've been given, right? And if anything's going to improve or change for the better, quote unquote, whatever that means, it's going to be in your loving service for your neighbor. That's how it's going to happen.
Well, I think for myself anyways, because I've reflected on this, essentially my ethics, my virtue ethics, put me in a political category when other people talk with me. They're the ones who put me in a political category. So I believe in personal integrity. I believe in cultivating value. Dignity is called. I believe in cultivating courage, moral courage, emotional courage, intellectual courage, physical courage. I believe in personal responsibility. I believe in changing yourself, and that in that way you change the world. And I believe that you take care of your neighbor.
Yeah.
And I believe that vocation is location. Mm-hmm. Whoever is right in front of me is my neighbor, and that's who I'm called to love and serve.
Yep. Right now, immediately. Yeah.
Now that then, according to some friends of mine, makes me a conservative politically. And I'm like, well, no, I'm just saying, like, based on my readings of Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, Cicero, Seneca, Cato the Younger, Zeno, whoever it might be, like, I read that and I go, this, for whatever reason, resonates with me.
Yeah.
And therefore, I'm going to embrace and embody this ethic in my neighborly vocation.
Yeah.
And then other people like, oh, you're a Republican. I'm like, no, I don't vote.
No, because I think the definition of conservative liberal has changed. Conservative are those who, I think it's becoming this, if it isn't already there, who don't trust institutions.
Yeah.
And at least for us. And liberal are those who put their trust in institutions and think that if we build bigger and better institutions, we're gonna remake this world, like one world government, one world bank, that kind of thing. Whereas historically, conservative people actually were pretty institutional, right?
Yes,
they wanted to retain institutions because they were good or right. I mean, like the country or the Constitution, right? And so there's probably both going on concurrently at the moment,
right? Family, marriage.
Well, but I was thinking about the comment you made about the church, saying that that the church is susceptible to this myth of progress too. And even though
100%,
you know, the pursuit of the better becomes its own morality. And why is that? It's because, like, I think we've said this before, but our particular church body is morally conservative, but actually is very progressive. Like we're always about growing bigger and better, having, balancing the budget or having a surplus, getting more students, getting more people. That's evangelism.
Right. We're capitalists when it comes to that stuff.
It's evangelism, but it's evangelism tied to economics.
Right. Exactly. We have to meet our 5 to 15% growth numbers for the year.
Well, so we can give the 5 to 15% pay scale increase and, and keep up with inflation.
And God help you as a congregation if you have to go backwards on your budget.
I was thinking about that too. Yeah.
You have to take money off the table for your pastor.
But if I suggest that and say, you know what, we're going to pull back, our giving's down by 40%, so we're going to pull back our spending by 40%. And that's going to be some hard choices, both me personally and other people.
Right.
That would be perceived as a liberal thing by most of my people who are kind of classic conservative people, who trust in institutions. I'm like, no, it's actually just being responsible.
And that's a great point, right? Classical liberalism doesn't actually resemble modern liberal politics at all.
And same with conservatism.
And same thing with conservatism. And
like today's Democratic Party looks like
the religious right from the early 80s.
Right. Whereas the Republican Party looks more like, I don't know, FDR or something, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. You're like, well, he was a Democrat.
Like, right. It's like, I don't know if I said it here, but Dave Rubin, for example, has his own show, his own podcast. He was on tour with Jordan Peterson. Dave's a gay man, married. They're going to have a kid. And yet now he's on Fox News all the time because he's considered a conservative.
Yeah. And he was like the MC for Jordan Peterson, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
when I was growing up, that would be an oxymoronic statement to say that a married gay man is a conservative Republican. Like that's not even an animal that exists in nature when I was growing up in the 80s.
It's unfathomable.
It didn't happen.
Right.
Yeah, completely.
But you ask him why.
But then you ask him why and you go, oh, you're right.
He's conservative economically, right?
Well, he is all about individual responsibility. Mm-hmm. He's all about personal integrity. He's all about, again, that don't trust the government just because they're the government. Think critically, ask questions, be a person of independence and individual integrity, and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And again, small government, small government, and leave me alone to live my life,
right?
Protect my freedoms, kind of thing. And so all of a sudden you find yourself in the same tent with a guy who is pro legalize all recreational drugs, but because he's also pro Second Amendment, he's a conservative. Or a married gay man who's now a conservative because he's pro small government and pro individual liberty, which is weird because obviously a gay man in America would be pro civil liberties.
Yeah.
I mean, that seems like a no-brainer to me.
Well, anyway, right?
Some. Right. But that's what I'm saying. And my point too, coming back to it, is my opinion is that a pastor should not have a political team that he plays for. Because when I read the prophets, especially the minor prophets like Zephaniah and Amos, they don't have a team. Well, they just show up and say, "Thus says the Lord." And whoever the king happens to be, and whoever the king's prophets happen to be, they're on the menu.
It's not just objectivity, although that's true too. I mean, they need to be able to criticize, whatever king's in place,
right?
But also, it doesn't go well, when a religious leader aligns himself with a king. I can't think of an example where it was like, when you think of like the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, and the Pope at the time of the Reformation. It's like, that didn't help the church or the empire.
Well, think about in the past, we've talked about Cranmer, for example, and how politically adept he was that he could survive that long with so many different rulers of so many different creeds.
Yeah.
And yet he navigated it where so many of his colleagues and peers were beheaded.
Right, but the criticism of him in his day, and certainly to this day, is that he was kind of a wuss, right?
Right.
Because he didn't speak the truth to power or something.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But he was a populist. He read the tea leaves and went, you know what? I'm just going to do my job.
Well, and in one sense, especially as a church, or as pastors, you got to stay above the fray because your priority is not to reprimand kings.
Right.
Be like John the Baptist, to Herod. Like, how dare you? Mm-hmm. I mean, if he's your parishioner, if the king's been given into your care, then you speak to him, I suppose, and damn the consequences. At the same time, we don't go out of our way to reprimand political leaders because our priority is to forgive sins. That's what we're around for, not necessarily of the government or institutions or political leaders, but for our people. And if there's a barrier that's like, well, pastor's not on my team.
Exactly. Right.
Then you can't preach to them anymore.
I've used the example before. He's not there anymore. He's retired. He might even actually be deceased by this point. But there was a pastor north of me when I first got here 12 years ago, and they had a communion statement. And the communion statement was, this is what you must agree to and confess in order to come to the Lord's Supper at this table, at this church.
Yeah.
You believe this is the body and blood of Jesus Christ. You're a member of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. You oppose women's ordination and gay marriage.
Yeah.
He had confused the two kingdoms.
Mm-hmm.
And people that were Democrats left the congregation. And that's how I was made aware of this, because they came to my church, and asked me that question right out of the gate. Like, what if we're Democrat?
Yeah.
And I didn't understand the context because they didn't give me any context. They just asked the question. And it just baffled me.
I had it like, what if we're in the union? The steelworkers union. Yeah. I had that in Indiana. Like, what if? Like, I don't agree with union policy. I don't know if unions are the right way to go about what you're looking to gain, right?
Yeah.
But what if?
What if? Right. Well, in our history in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, there was always the popular case of, what if they're Masons?
Mm-hmm.
What if they belong to the Masonic Lodge in their town?
I've had insight in the lodge. I mean, it's pagan through and through.
Well, 100%. No, 100%. I did too on my vicarage.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's when I was made aware of this, actually, in C.F.W. Walther's letter to a pastor about this, because most of the men in the congregation where I did my vicarage were Masons. They had the belt buckle or the ring, and, well, it's just a social club. You should come and check it out. My spider sense tingled because talking with Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, Christian Scientists, Scientologists, I got the same vibe.
Yep.
And then afterwards, when I met with my supervisor, the pastor, he said, yeah, when I first got here, I went because I wanted to, again,
find out what's going on, right?
Yeah, figure out, get the lay of the land. He's like, no, it's a cult. 100%. Like, it's a cult.
And for you and I, it's like, how could you coexist in both worlds? And for the people in it, they don't necessarily see it.
Well, where I was, one, it's indoctrination. It's generational, multi-generational. Two, as my supervisor pointed out, if you don't join the Masons, you don't do business in this town. And that was a fact because all the small business owners ran the lodge.
Yeah.
So in order to get a storefront, even get permission to open a store in town, you had to join the Masons. That's how they got you.
And there's a lot of wacky stuff. My grandfather was Mason. Schreiner, I mentioned that before. And after he died, we were going through stuff at his house. And he had like the history of the Masons, like this book written by a Mason. It was an official like history book, and you're reading it, and it's bold. It's like the founder guy, I can't remember his name. You know, he went on a business trip to Saudi Arabia or somewhere, you know, in the Far East. Yeah, and he looked around and like, this stuff's cool. Oh, it was a World's Fair as well. So you know, there were people that had traveled for the World's Fair, and he saw it, and he's like, you know what? I'm just going to adopt all that stuff and bring it in and just use it as like our identifying kind of stuff. So the fez and the scimitars and all this kind of stuff. Yeah. And it's like, and it's all just pageantry, right?
Of course.
And even the use of the Quran, which they use, like, like they don't believe any of it has like religious. It's all just, well, like I said, pageantry, or what's another way? It's a tribal kind of distinguishing mark. That's it.
It's the power of symbol to energize a group or a movement.
Right. But I think the problem that we look at this stuff and say, well, nothing is completely inanimate, right? Benign. Yeah. No, wherever falsehood can take hold, I mean, that's where the devil works. Right. All right, friends, that's going to be the end of this episode. We're going to split it into two parts for your listening enjoyment and also, well, because that's what we do. So join us again later this week. You'll hear the second part of our conversation. We'll just jump right back in and talk about the power of symbol and propaganda and as it's being used on us and by us maybe today. All right, so see you soon.